Hi everybody, my name is Dickson. I want to thank you for joining me for another edition of our structure fishing workshop. We entered into a study the last time we talked of structure breaks and break lines. And I reminded you that we had done a complete study last summer on structure, on the 17 different types of structure we have. But I didn't get into too much detail in describing those structures when it comes to the breaks and the break lines, the additional features that fish need to make their migrations on structure. And I want to start by just identifying the reason behind that before we really get started. And it's this simple. Fish take in about 5 times more light in their eyes than we humans do. And they see very, very well, even underwater, fortunately. But they can see really well, but they can't see very far. And as you probably have seen in our study on structure, most structures are so large that there's no way that the fish from their deep water sanctuary can see the whole structure. They can't. They can't see it. It's that simple. So as they're instinctively making these movements or migrations on a structure, they need to have some additional help to find their way. If they can't find their way, that structure will be eliminated over time. In fact, as we get into this study, I'm going to be using a lot of diagrams and a lot of little drawings to make a point so that you can visibly and visually get an idea of what the heck it is I'm talking about. Because if you can't see it in your mind's eyes, you're going to just pass over it and it won't become very important to you. But I want you to be able to see what we're talking about here. I've got a side view here of a body of water, and I'm demonstrating some of the things that would break up the uniformity of the structure and help the fish making their movement and migration. The first one at the top of this structure, we have a weed line. Well, a section of weeds break up the uniformity of the structure, so that qualifies as a break. It's actually a form of a break line. We'll talk more about that later, but it's a break on structure. And the next thing we show is a rock pile of rocks on the structure. It's a break on that structure. And then we have a break line occurring. Remember, we said a break line in reality is a break on structure. It's just a little bit different in that it runs for a distance as opposed to the other breaks. And then we have the other breaks that you can see there in our diagram, and we have the last break line going off into deep water. Now in our study, when we talk about break lines, form of a break. And you can have multiple break lines on structure, but the final break going into the deep water is referred to by Buck as the drop-off. So anytime we're talking about break lines, you know the drop-off is in fact a break line, but it's the last break line. It's the final break line into deep water. That's referred to as a drop-off. So here you have just a multitude of breaks and break lines, and this is what we're going to be talking about. This is what the fish utilize as they're making their movements on structure. And as Buck told me years ago, he said, you know, instinctively, they want to make this move, this daily movement towards the shallows when the weather permits. And it's instinctive to them to move, but they have to be able to find their way. You've got to be able to see a pathway. You have to have something lead you, take you on that journey, and then bring you back. And that's the reason he told me that when fish are moving on these features, they pause. At each one of these breaks, they'll stop and they'll pause for a time. And they'll look beyond that and make sure they can see that next signpost, whatever it is, pile of rocks, break line, whatever it is. When they see it, then they'll move to it. And if they didn't see anything else, movement would have to stop right there, because instinctively they have to have a way back to their sanctuary zone. And if there's no more signposts, they've got to turn around and go back. So it's nice to know that when these fish are moving, they're identifying these breaks and they pause, sometimes for quite a 5 minutes, 10 minutes. They'll pause at a break, and if weather and water conditions allow, they'll move on to the next signpost, whatever that break is, until they can't go any further due to the weather and the water. So again, just so you understand, it's important to get them up towards the shallows, but it's even more important instinctively to the fish. It's more important to get them back to their sanctuary zone. So I've experienced this many times. The fish would be moving and they stay with me for maybe 30 minutes, 35, 40, 45 minutes. And you can see them just getting closer and closer to the boat. And then when that movement is over and they leave, they're gone. On occasion, you can catch maybe one fish, two at the most that I can ever remember as they were going off the structure, going back home. So there's very little pausing and there's no stopping going back and very little pausing. Once that movement's over, back down home they go. Now, if we understand how fish use these signposts, how they have to have these different breaks on structure in order for that structure to really produce. Once we understand that, it should start to sink in that, well, if they pause and eventually stop at one of these features, it's going to allow you and me to be able to pinpoint our fishing by fishing these features. Breaks and break lines. And Buck said to me one day, he said, you know, isn't it wonderful that that's how fish do it? Because otherwise, he said, we'd have a lot harder time catching fish. And every time that we'd be on some strange lake we'd never seen before, and we'd do a little map interpretation of find a feature or a structure, and he'd stop and anchor the boat and then drill his finger in the water and say, there's our fish. And in the beginning years with him, beginning months with him, when he'd do that, I'd just shake my head. You know, it was like it was magic, and he was always right. And it wouldn't be long, we were catching a fish right where he drilled his finger in the water. And I didn't really understand it for a while, till I fully understood structure, breaks, and break lines. Sharper breaks, contact points, pinpointing our fishing. You see, if you're on a structure and the fish aren't moving when you arrive there, and you decide you're going to wait for them because you've caught fish there before, if it wasn't for this fact that they utilize these breaks and break lines, where would you wait for them? Where would you anchor your boat? Where would you sit while you were waiting? But Buck knew where to wait, drilling his finger in the water. Here they are. Breaks and break lines and contact points. Through a map and interpretation, following the break lines, identifying what's there, we will know the exact spot to sit and wait and fan cast until those fish become active and moving. When they do, we're not going to miss them because we're at the right spot. We're pinpointing our fishing through the breaks and the break lines. Now, in order to get a complete understanding of it all, I'm going to first deal with break lines because there's so many different and various types of break lines. We need to identify them. I'm going to use some of these figures and drawings to identify them for you. Then I'm going to talk about them and understand that each one of these break lines will produce you fish. So you got to know that they exist. You got to know how to where to look for them and how to identify them when you see them. So I'm going to start showing you some pictures here of different types of break lines. And I'm going to start with the very simple break line where we have an increase in depth. And this first one shows you about a 3-foot drop. But it's a sudden drop from 11 feet to 14 feet. That's what we call a 3-foot break. And we want to fish that 11-foot break line. And at times we want to fish the bottom break line, which is occurring at 14 feet. Remember I said break line can be an increase, a sudden increase in depth, but it also can be a sudden decrease in depth. So those are two spots that we want to fish. So we actually have two break lines there, not one. We have two. I wanted to use as an example of that base break line a couple of examples. So much of my key when doing my promotional fishing, when I was taking all the Raiders fishing, you know, I joked about always having a critic in the front of the boat, but I would make this boast, and it's how we made our TV show by saying I could go to any reservoir and within 1 hour be catching fish. Well, my key to doing all that was dams and causeways. I shared that with you. Those two structure types never failed me. So that's how I could make those bold statements. All I did was pick a decent weather condition and say, let's go, and right to the one, either the causeway or the dam, and we'd be catching fish. Now, a lot of guys will go ahead and fish causeways and dams, but they don't know exactly how to present the lures and how to go about it. But I have a diagram right here where I'm showing you an example of that base break line. They put all that rocky riprap in there, jam all these rocks in the dam and in the causeways to help keep down the erosion and so on and so forth. But they'll stack those rocks in there, and we want to be ticking and fishing those areas. And they're nice and clean and easy to work, but we don't just want to fish them anywhere. In most cases, some of those dams are just sort of straight up and down, you know. There's no additional break lines and things. It's just kind of stacking lures down. But you go all the way down to there are no more rocks till you hit the base of that thing. Where there are no more rocks, you're at that base. You can see it right there in that little drawing. And that's an important break line to fish. Right at the base of those rocks, the base of that dam. We're going to stack lures and check all depths because the fish will move up from time to time, but we also have to check that base of that dam. That's one great example. Another great example is when we're working deep structure, and we have, like at our summer schools, we had 45-foot breaking into 60 feet all over the place. Well, most people fishing that drop off at 45 feet think, well, man, I've done my job. I've gone as far deep as I can go. I've done my work. Most of you already know I met my wife up at Muskie where we had our summer school. Well, my wife and I, one September, we decided to go up and fish some muskie, just the two of us. And we went up, did a lot of fishing, and had a lot of fun and just enjoyed our time. We did a lot of that muskie fishing in Rough Rock Lake. It was a lake that I really liked, and it was about a 15-mile run up to Rough Rock from where we were staying. And at the end of the day, we come back to where we were staying, and where we catch all the walleyes in the early summer. We'd always make a couple of trolling passes, just for nostalgia reasons, if nothing else, And we catch a couple of walleye, but the walleyes weren't in there thick at that time. It's September now. It's different than we were there in June, so seasonally it was a different situation. But we caught a few fish, but I think the biggest fish we had caught was maybe 6 pounds over 3 or 4 days. And on the 5th day, I think it was the 5th day, maybe the 6th day we were there, we're coming in, and I said, we've fished down to 47-foot break line, but we hadn't hit the base break line on our saddle. Now the saddle breaks 35, 37 feet, 42 feet, 47 feet, drop off into 60 feet. But we hadn't been catching many fish. I said, let's make a pass on the base break line at 60 feet. Now, to help you better understand what that base break line is, we have a picture here, but think about it like this. You got your ceiling to your living room. Let's call that the drop off up there. And down at the baseboard, that's the base break line. It's a line that runs for a distance on structure, connected to structure. But it's a decrease in depth rather than an increase in depth. In this case, at the base of that saddle was 60 feet. And we were running 60 foot with solid steel wire line. And we came up through there, and as we come to the hook in the saddle, what I used to call the hook, I think I've drawn that for you before, but at any rate, it's connected to the saddle. She had a hard strike, and I saw the rod double up, and I thought, boy, that's a big fish. That's probably a 10-pound fish. And she fought that fish, and we were just sort of giggling and talking about how we know it's a good fish, and just having a good time. And when she finally saw that fish, and when I finally saw that fish, it was the biggest walleye I'd ever seen come out of that water. Sure enough, we put it in a boat. It weighed 13 pounds in September. There were no eggs in that fish. It weighed 13 pounds. 36 inches long, a walleye now. 13 pounds. Base break line. A decrease in depth that runs for a distance on or connected to structure. An important break line. Don't ever forget about it. Most fishermen do forget about it. They don't even consider it. I work it all the time. In the case of a dam or a causeway, good example of how you can see that. But any other structure where it bottoms out into that deep water, we want to run that base break line. As long as we can identify it, we run it. Mainly on the troll, we're searching. We can't always find them down there, you know that, 60 feet or 50 feet at that base, but we're still going to fish it, and occasionally you'll get a real surprise, like my wife got, 13-pound walleye. That's her best ever, of course. And it was the biggest one we've ever caught up there. We caught 3 or 4 over 12, or right at 12. Caught probably 15 or 20 or 30 at 11-pound class, and hundreds over 10 pounds, but none 13. So she has the record. But that's where it was caught. So it's an important break line, regardless of how deep it is. That base break line should always be fished. Okay, let's move on. Now, the last time we talked, I mentioned that there are a bunch of break lines that exist that are really easy to identify, to recognize. But some are so small that only the best fishermen find them and recognize them. So, as we're fishing in Florida, I gave you an example the other day. Best bass lake I ever fished. The best bass lake I ever fished. We were fishing 6-inch break lines. Break line breaking from 9.5 to 10 feet. Had another one 11.5 to 12 feet. We were fishing 6-inch break lines. But once you understand the lake type, the geographical location, the lake type, the type of reservoir, you're looking for certain types of structure, number one. And then you're also, once you understand all of this about breaks and break lines, you're looking for specific types of breaks and break lines. For instance, in Florida, I already know I'm looking for 1-foot break lines. When I was looking for 1-foot break lines in this new lake, I found 6-inch break lines. You know, stop and think about it. If I was out here in Florida looking for a 5-foot drop-off, I would have never recognized that 6-inch break line. But I was looking for what is typical to these shallow saucer lakes, which is a 1-foot break line. Looking for the 1-foot break line, it was easily, especially with my meter, it was easily distinguishable to see a 6-inch break line. When I told Buck about it, he said, well, think about it. That's like a curb to a fish. They can see that readily and move right along it. That's not a big deal. He wasn't all that surprised. He was a little surprised, I'm sure, but not a lot surprised. It made me feel like, well, yeah, I guess that's the way it is. It's normal. And we fished that lake for 3 years. I mean, it was just 6-inch break lines. But typical in Florida is 1-foot break lines. That's what we have because of the lake type, shallow saucer lakes. Let me give you another example to take that to the extreme. One of my favorite fishing holes, Lake Erie. It's a big, huge, deep saucer type lake. You can come a couple of miles off the shoreline it's just sloping, 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 sloping. The biggest catch I ever made numbers-wise of smallmouth bass, big smallmouth. I caught 45 feet of water in Lake Erie on a reef, 45 feet, breaking to 47 feet, a 2-foot break line, 2 feet. In Lake Erie. You know, it's like fishing the ocean. But all my fish were on a break line that only broke 2 feet, 45 to 47 feet in the area of that lake where I was fishing. And I think over that week we caught, over 5 days, 4 or 5 days of fishing, we caught over 1,000 smallmouth. 45 to 47, 2-foot break. So these break lines, we know what we're looking for because of the lake type, the geographic, and so on and so forth. If it's a reservoir, whatever it is, we know what it is we're looking for before we go because we've done our homework. And then when you see these break lines and you recognize them and you begin to fish them, you start running into the fish, my friends. These are the most important things you could ever do, would be able to learn all about these break lines, what they look like, how many different types there are, and how to go about fishing them. And your fishing life will change. Mine certainly did. Break lines. A line-on structure that runs a distance where you have an increase or a decrease in depth. something that stops the fish, a wall to the fish, and they move along it, on or connected to structure. Now, some people have asked me how do fish see and recognize these break lines. It's not like it's a big pile of rocks or it's a big stump or something that they see. How do they see a break line? Simple. If you've never done it, you should do it. Put a scuba tank on and go drop down in the lake to about 30, 35 feet and look up to a spot where maybe there's a little drop off at 15 feet and see if you can't see a color change taking place. I'm going to tell you, you can. It's a complete change in color. Sun is creating this complete lake change. Now, you and I can see it with scuba gear on. And the fish sees 5 times better than we do. They see that break line or that drop off as a light change. And they move to it and follow along it. A break line. There's all kinds of different break lines, sizes and shapes. And next time we talk, we're going to cover more and more and more about break lines until we get to the end. And then hopefully you'll have a complete understanding of it and how important it is to you and me when it comes to catching more and bigger fish. So till the next time, be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already done it. We appreciate you, my friends, and we'll see you the next time.